Imagine a manuscript arriving in Florence in the year 1463. Not a Bible, not a standard piece of Greek philosophy, something stranger. A collection of dialogues between a vast cosmic being called the Shepherd of Men and a human soul who receives, in a single overwhelming vision, the entire story of how reality came into being. The text claimed to be the secret wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, a sage said to be older than Moses, older than Plato, and possibly older than civilization itself. The man who received the manuscript, a philosopher named Marsilio Ficino, had been working for his patron Cosimo de Medici on a translation of Plato's complete works. When Cosimo saw what had arrived, he told Ficino to stop. "Stop, Plato. Translate this first." That instruction alone tells you what this collection meant to the people who encountered it. For over 1,000 years, the texts now called the Corpus Hermeticum had circulated in fragments, whispered about in Gnostic communities, preserved by Byzantine scholars, and debated by church fathers who were simultaneously fascinated and unnerved by what they read. At the center of these texts sat something that felt simultaneously ancient and completely radical, a vision of the divine that had far more in common with Gnostic cosmology than with anything Orthodox Christianity or official Greek philosophy was comfortable admitting. This is the full story of the Corpus Hermeticum, not an overview, not a highlight reel. Every tradition it draws from, every concept it wrestles with, every figure it invokes, every scholarly dispute it has generated, and every thread connecting it to the Gnostic world that surrounded it. Where it came from, what it actually says, how it shaped Gnostic thought, what was lost, what survived, and why the questions it raises still do not have clean answers. To understand the Corpus Hermeticum, you have to understand the city that produced it, Alexandria. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Alexandria was the most intellectually alive city in the Mediterranean world. It had been that way for nearly 300 years, ever since Alexander the Great founded it and his general Ptolemy turned it into the capital of a new Greek-speaking Egyptian kingdom. The Great Library of Alexandria, at its height, held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Scholars from across the ancient world came to read, argue, and write. But what made Alexandria truly extraordinary was not just the volume of its learning, it was the collision. Egyptian priests, Greek philosophers, Jewish mystics, Syrian astrologers, Persian magi, and early Christians all lived and worked in proximity to one another. They shared streets, markets, and very often ideas. When a tradition does not live in isolation, it changes, it borrows, and it is borrowed from. The philosophical climate of Alexandria in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era was defined by this kind of creative collision. Out of that collision came several remarkable intellectual movements. One of them was Gnosticism. Another, emerging from the same environment, sharing many of the same concerns and many of the same sources, was the tradition scholars call Hermetism. Greek philosophy had undergone a significant transformation by this point. Plato's ideas had been absorbed and reshaped by centuries of commentary, and the resulting tradition, called Middle Platonism, had become preoccupied with a specific cluster of questions. What is the ultimate nature of the divine? How does a perfect and transcendent God relate to an imperfect and material world? What is the human soul? Where did it come from? And where is it going? These were not merely academic questions. They were urgent, felt questions, the kind that drive people to found new religious movements and write visionary texts in the middle of the night. Egyptian religion had its own answers to these questions, and by this period those answers were being expressed through Greek philosophical categories. The great Egyptian god Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and sacred knowledge, had long been associated by Greek-speaking Egyptians with their own Hermes, the messenger god and divine intermediary. The result of this fusion was Hermes Trismegistus, meaning Hermes the thrice great. The texts attributed to this composite figure began to appear during the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, and collectively they form what we know as Hermetic literature. The Corpus Hermeticum specifically refers to a collection of 17 Greek philosophical dialogues that were brought together in Byzantium during the medieval period. But those 17 texts are part of a larger body of Hermetic writing that includes the Latin text known as the Asclepius, a set of excerpts preserved by a 5th century anthologist named Stobaeus, a collection called the Definitions of Hermes Trismegistus, preserved in Armenian, and scattered fragments in other sources. To understand the Corpus Hermeticum fully, you have to understand all of these, because they represent different facets of the same tradition. Scholars have long distinguished between two kinds of Hermetic literature. The first is what they call technical Hermetism, texts about astrology, alchemy, magic, and divination. Practical knowledge attributed to Hermes Trismegistus as the master of sacred arts. The second is what they call philosophical Hermetism. These are the texts that deal with cosmology, theology, the nature of the soul, and the path to divine knowledge. The Corpus Hermeticum belongs to this second category, and it is within the philosophical Hermetic texts that the connections to Gnosticism are strongest, deepest, and most genuinely fascinating. Before going further into the texts themselves, it is worth pausing to understand who Hermes Trismegistus actually was, or more precisely, what he was. Because the answer to that question has changed dramatically over time, and the misunderstandings surrounding it have shaped how these texts have been received for centuries. In the ancient world, it was widely believed, both by people inside the Hermetic tradition and by many outside it, that Hermes Trismegistus was a real historical person, a sage of incredible antiquity, an Egyptian priest-king who had lived before Moses, before the Greeks, before recorded history as anyone knew it. The texts themselves support this impression, presenting Hermes as a teacher speaking directly to his son Tat, or to his student Asclepius, or receiving wisdom from a divine being called Poimandres. The tone is intimate, authoritative, and ancient. The church father, Clement of Alexandria, writing around 200 CE, described Hermes Trismegistus as the author of 42 sacred books covering all of Egyptian knowledge. The theologian Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, quoted Hermetic texts with reverence, treating Hermes as a pagan prophet who had somehow anticipated Christian truths about God and the Son of God. Even Augustine of Hippo, in the early 5th century, knew the Hermetic texts well enough to argue against them at length. The belief in the historical reality of Hermes Trismegistus was nearly universal through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. The truth, as scholars now understand it, is more complex and in many ways more interesting. Hermes Trismegistus was not a historical person. He was a literary and theological construction, a composite figure built from the merger of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, given an identity as an author precisely because the text needed an authority. In the ancient world, attributing a text to a famous or ancient figure was a common practice, and not necessarily a deceptive one. It was a way of saying, this wisdom belongs to a tradition older than any individual author. Thoth, in Egyptian religion, was the scribe of the gods, the one who recorded the weighing of souls in the afterlife, the master of hieroglyphics and of all sacred arts. When Egyptian priests working in Greek translation talked about their wisdom tradition, Thoth became Hermes. He became thrice great because the superlative title was a way of signaling that this was not just any Hermes, this was the divine source of all Hermetic knowledge. The threefold greatness reflected a standard Egyptian epithet of praise applied to Thoth, transposed into Greek. Understanding this is essential to understanding the Corpus Hermeticum honestly. These are not texts from ancient Egypt. They are texts from Roman-era Alexandria, composed in Greek, probably between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE. They are deeply shaped by Greek philosophy, particularly by Plato and the Platonic tradition as it had developed. They are also shaped by Jewish ideas about creation and the nature of humanity that were circulating in Alexandria, and they carry Egyptian religious concepts refracted through a Greek philosophical lens. What emerges from this combination is something entirely its own, not Greek philosophy, not Egyptian religion, not Jewish mysticism. Something that drew from all three and became, in the process, one of the most distinctive bodies of religious and philosophical literature to survive from the ancient world. The name Corpus Hermeticum refers to a specific collection, 17 Greek texts gathered together and preserved in Byzantine manuscript form. Brought to the West in 1463, when a Byzantine monk named Leonardo of Pistoia carried a manuscript from Macedonia to Florence as a gift for Cosimo de Medici. The collection is not thematically uniform, and this surprises most people who come to it expecting a single coherent system. Some tractates are written as dialogues between Hermes Trismegistus and a divine being who teaches him. Some are dialogues between Hermes and his son Tat, or his student Asclepius. Some read more like sermons or philosophical treatises. One, the very first text in the collection, and the most famous, is a visionary narrative in which a cosmic being called Poimandres appears to a seeker and reveals the entire structure of creation. The name Poimandres is often translated as shepherd of men, though some scholars prefer to read it as mind of sovereignty, and the debate about that translation reflects deeper disagreements about the theology the text is expressing. The collection contains what scholars have identified as both optimistic and pessimistic strands of thought. In some texts, the material world is treated as fundamentally good, the beautiful creation of a good God, and the path to divine knowledge involves recognizing the divine presence within the cosmos. In other texts, the material world is treated with much more suspicion as something to be escaped rather than celebrated. This internal tension is one of the most interesting features of the Corpus Hermeticum, and it is directly relevant to understanding the relationship between Hermetism and Gnosticism, because Gnostic texts show an almost identical range of attitudes toward creation, from the sharply dualistic to the more nuanced. Beyond the 17 tractates of the Corpus Hermeticum, the Hermetic literature includes several other important bodies of writing. The Asclepius, known in Latin but originally composed in Greek, is a dialogue between Hermes, his student Asclepius, and two others. It covers many of the same themes as the Corpus Hermeticum, but with significant additions, including the famous Lament of Hermes, in which Hermes prophesies the coming destruction of Egyptian religion. That section is among the most moving passages in all of ancient religious literature, and it will be examined in full later. The Stobaeus excerpts add substantially to the picture. John of Stobae was a 5th century anthologist who preserved long passages from texts that would otherwise be completely lost. Among his excerpts are several substantial pieces of Hermetic writing, including a text called Cor Cosmo, meaning Virgin of the World, which presents a different cosmological account from the one in Poimandres, and gives an important role to the goddess Isis as a revealer of divine wisdom. These excerpts significantly expand our picture of what Hermetic literature actually contained. The definitions of Hermes Trismegistus, preserved in Armenian translation and probably translated from Greek in the 6th century, is a collection of short, crisp philosophical propositions. It is less well known than the other texts, but genuinely valuable for understanding the core concepts of Hermetic thought in their most compressed form. Together, these bodies of writing constitute the full literary record of philosophical Hermetism, and that record raises questions that go to the heart of Gnostic religious history, starting with the most fundamental question of all: what is actually going on in Poimandres? Tractate, one of the Corpus Hermeticum, is called Poimandres, named for the divine being who appears in it. It is the longest, the most comprehensive, and the most structurally important text in the collection. Everything else in the Corpus Hermeticum can, in some sense, be read as commentary on or expansion of what Poimandres establishes, so it deserves careful attention. The tractate opens with the narrator, who is Hermes, describing a moment of inward turning. His thoughts had grown still. He was in a kind of waking meditation, and suddenly a vast being appeared to him, filling his entire field of awareness. This being identified itself as Poimandres, the mind of absolute power, and asked what Hermes wanted to learn. Hermes said he wanted to know the nature of reality, to understand all things. And Poimandres said, "Pay attention, and hold in your mind everything you are about to learn." What follows is a cosmogonic vision, a vision of how reality came into being, told in a sequence that is remarkably specific and remarkably strange to anyone coming to it fresh. Hermes saw boundless light, delightful and serene, then darkness, moving downward, coiling, terrible, becoming what Poimandres described as a moist nature shot through with a kind of smoke, giving off a sound of indescribable lamentation. Out of this light descended a holy word, a logos, which came down upon the moist nature and began to impose order on the darkness below. Anyone who knows the opening of the Gospel of John will immediately recognize a resonance here. "In the beginning was the Word," says that Gospel, "and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Scholars have debated this parallel intensely. Was the author of Poimandres influenced by John's Gospel? Was the author of John influenced by Hermetic ideas? Or were both drawing on a shared pool of Middle Platonic and Jewish cosmological speculation that was circulating in Alexandria? No definitive answer exists. What is clear is that both texts are using the concept of the Logos, the divine word or reason, as the mediating principle between a transcendent God and a created world. This concept was in the intellectual air of Alexandria. Everyone breathed it. Poimandres then explained the structure of what Hermes had seen. The God who transcends all things, simply called mind or nous, brought forth a second mind, described as a craftsman, a demiurge, who fashioned 7 spheres governing the visible cosmos. The word demiurge here is enormously significant, and it is worth pausing on. Plato had used this term in his dialogue, the Timaeus, to describe the divine craftsman who shaped the material world according to eternal patterns. In Platonic thought, the demiurge was a benign figure doing good work, but in the Hermetic account, and far more sharply in the Gnostic accounts that emerged from the same intellectual environment, the demiurge becomes a much more ambiguous figure, something between a craftsman and a limitation on human freedom. The 7 spheres in Poimandres correspond to the 7 visible planets of ancient astronomy: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Each sphere is governed by what the text calls a fate. Each fate, as the soul descends through these spheres on its way into physical embodiment, gives the soul one of the qualities that will define its earthly existence: aggression, ambition, desire, pride, arrogance, the tendency to accumulate and never share, and deception. These are not gifts. They are limitations. They are the conditions of material existence, imposed on the soul by the rulers of the planetary spheres as the price of descent into matter. Any student of Gnostic literature will immediately recognize this structure. In Sethian Gnosticism, the material cosmos is governed by archons, divine or semi-divine beings who rule over different levels of creation and who, whether through ignorance or deliberate malice, imprison human souls in matter. In the Valentinian Gnostic system, the demiurge who created the material world is not the highest god but a lesser being who mistakes himself for the supreme deity. The Hermetic version of this picture is not identical to either Sethian or Valentinian Gnosticism, but the structural resonances are unmistakable. How did a perfect God produce an imperfect world? Why do human souls feel trapped in bodies? What is the path out? These are the questions both traditions are answering with almost identical cosmological architecture. What happens next in Poimandres is where the story becomes truly extraordinary. After describing the creation of the cosmos and its governing spirits, Poimandres reveals the origin of the human being. The divine mind, the transcendent God, had a beloved offspring, the primordial man, the Anthropos. This Anthropos was a being of pure light, fashioned in the image of the divine mind itself. The Anthropos looked down through the cosmic spheres and saw his own reflection in the waters of matter below. He fell in love with that reflection, and in falling in love with it, he fell into it. He descended through the planetary spheres. As he passed through each one, he took on the qualities of that sphere. He became entangled with matter. He forgot who he was. This is the Hermetic account of the human condition. Human beings are divine minds trapped in material bodies, having forgotten their true origin. The soul carries within it a spark of the divine Anthropos, the primordial man of light, and the ignorance, the forgetting, is not merely intellectual, it is existential. The soul does not know what it is, and because it does not know, it cannot escape the cycle of embodiment. The path out, according to Poimandres, is Gnosis, knowledge, but not just any knowledge. The knowledge of oneself as fundamentally divine, the recognition of the divine mind within oneself as identical with the divine mind that underlies all things. When the soul genuinely achieves this recognition, it begins the process of ascending back through the planetary spheres, shedding at each level the quality that sphere had imposed upon it during the descent, until finally it returns to its source. The cosmology laid out in Poimandres is the foundation of everything else in the Corpus Hermeticum, and it deserves to be unpacked carefully, because it is more structured than it might appear on first reading. At the top of the Hermetic Cosmos sits the One, the transcendent God, described in terms that are almost paradoxical. This God is beyond description, beyond name, beyond any quality that language can assign. It is not even accurate to call this God good, because goodness implies a quality, and the transcendent God is beyond all qualities. The Hermetic texts describe this God as the source of all light, the source of all being, but never as something that can be grasped conceptually. This approach to the divine, describing God only by what it is not, rather than what it is called apophatic theology. It is one of the most distinctive features shared by Hermetic thought and Gnostic thought alike, and it connects both traditions to the broader stream of Platonic philosophy, particularly to the strand that would later be called Neoplatonism. The highest God cannot be said to exist in the same way created things exist. The highest God cannot be said to think in the way minds think. The highest God is the source of existence and mind, which means it is prior to both, and therefore beyond any description derived from either. Below this transcendent One, in the Hermetic scheme, comes the divine mind, the nous, which is in some formulations identical with the highest God, and in others a kind of first emanation from it. The nous is described in Poimandres as both the father of the Logos and the craftsman of fire and spirit. From the nous proceeds the Logos, the divine word or reason, which is the active principle of creation. The Logos is what gives form to matter, what imposes order on the formless darkness below. Then comes the demiurge, the craftsman of the material world, who fashions the 7 planetary spheres and appoints over each a governing power. These 7 governing powers are what Poimandres calls the governors. They rule over fate, over the material cosmos, over the conditions of embodied existence. Each corresponds to a planet, and each has its own character, its own influence, its own contribution to the net of fate that human souls are caught in. Below the 7 planetary spheres is the realm of the fixed stars. Below that, the sublunary world of Earth, where the 4 classical elements, fire, water, air, and earth, combine and recombine to produce the material things we experience. Now, how does this compare to Gnostic cosmology? The comparison is striking. In Sethian Gnostic texts, the material world is created by a figure called Yaldabaoth or Saklas, sometimes described as the demiurge, who is a flawed or even malevolent creator god. Yaldabaoth creates a series of archons to govern the material cosmos. These archons are clearly analogous to the Hermetic governors. In the Sethian picture, the archons are explicitly hostile to human souls. They constructed the human body as a kind of trap, a material prison to hold the divine spark of light that had fallen from the pleroma, the divine fullness above. The Hermetic system is not quite as dark. In most philosophical Hermetic texts, the governors are not presented as actively evil. They are more like agents of fate, enforcing the laws of the material cosmos without necessarily meaning harm, but the functional role they play is structurally identical to that of the Gnostic archons. They stand between the human soul and its divine source. They are the gatekeepers through which the ascending soul must pass. And in some of the more pessimistic Hermetic texts, the influence of the governors begins to look more like what the Gnostics would openly call tyranny. Above the 7 planetary spheres, in the Hermetic cosmos, is a region called the Ogdoad, meaning the 8th. This is the realm beyond the material cosmos, beyond the rule of the governors, the first level of the purely divine world. The soul that successfully ascends through the 7 spheres enters the Ogdoad and experiences for the first time the direct presence of divine light without any material mediation. Beyond the Ogdoad is the Ennead, meaning the 9th, a still higher level of divine reality, and beyond that is the direct presence of the Father himself. This numerological structure, 7, then 8, then 9, appears in various forms in both Hermetic and Gnostic literature, and it reflects the deeply mathematical character of both traditions' understanding of the cosmos. Reality is structured, it has levels, and the spiritual path is a matter of ascending through those levels, shedding the limitations of each one as you go. The most philosophically important element of Poimandres, and the one with the most direct connections to Gnostic thought, is the Anthropos Myth. the story of how the primordial divine human came to be trapped in matter. The details matter enormously, so let us go through it carefully. In the Hermetic account, the divine mind, after creating the 7 governors, looked into the lower world and recognized itself mirrored in the creation it had produced. From this recognition, the heavenly Anthropos, the primordial man, came into being. This figure was not just any creation. He was the image of the divine mind, pure light, pure reason, bearing within himself all the qualities of the divine. The 7 governors saw him and fell in love with him. Each gave him a share of their own nature, and then the Anthropos himself looked down. He saw the material world below him, and crucially, he saw his own image reflected in the waters of matter. He loved what he saw. He descended toward his own reflection, falling through the 7 spheres, and nature, seeing this beautiful being approaching, reached up and embraced him. The two became intertwined. The divine was entangled with the material. The result is the human being as we actually are, partly divine and partly material. The body is material, subject to the governors, subject to fate, and subject to death. But within the body is something that does not belong there, the divine spark, the fragment of the Anthropos, the light that remembers, however faintly, its origin in the divine mind. This story is the Hermetic explanation of why human beings feel divided, why we feel simultaneously at home in the physical world and profoundly alienated from it. Why something in us reaches toward the infinite even while we are caught up in the daily mechanics of biological existence. The fall is not punishment. It is not a moral failure in the conventional sense. It is the consequence of love misdirected, of a divine being becoming so captivated by its own image that it lost sight of its own nature. That is the tragedy at the heart of the Hermetic vision of humanity. Compare this to the Gnostic myths. In Sethian Gnosticism, the archons created a human body and tried to trap within it the divine light that had fallen from the pleroma. The divine spark within human beings is a fragment of the true God, imprisoned in matter through the ignorance or malice of inferior divine powers. In Valentinian Gnosticism, human beings are divided into 3 types based on what dominates in them: the purely material, the psychic or soulish, and the pneumatic or spiritual. The pneumatic are those in whom the divine spark is strong enough to achieve liberation through Gnosis. The Hermetic Anthropos myth shares the fundamental structure of this Gnostic anthropology. The human being is a composite creature, partly divine and partly not, and the divine part has forgotten itself. Ordinary human existence is a condition of ignorance, of being asleep to one's true nature. Waking up, recognizing the divine origin of the self, is the beginning of liberation. This is what the Hermetic texts mean when they talk about Gnosis, and it is exactly what the Gnostic texts mean when they use the same word. Where the Hermetic version differs from mainstream Gnostic versions is in emotional register. In most Sethian Gnostic accounts, there is a strong sense of outrage. The archons are oppressors. The material world is a prison built by beings who were malicious or deeply ignorant. The Hermetic texts are, for the most part, calmer, more philosophical. The governors impose fate, but they are part of the divine order. The material world is imperfect, but it is still in some sense the work of the divine mind. The task of the human soul is not to rebel against creation, but to transcend it through understanding. This difference in register is one of the things that leads some scholars to argue that Hermetism and Gnosticism are fundamentally distinct traditions. But it does not erase the structural similarity of the underlying theological questions. The word Gnosis appears constantly in the Corpus Hermeticum, and understanding what the texts actually mean by it is essential to understanding how this tradition connects to the broader Gnostic world. In ordinary Greek, Gnosis simply means knowledge, but in both Hermetic and Gnostic usage, it carries a specialized meaning that ordinary intellectual knowledge does not cover. Gnosis in this context is not information acquired by studying. It is not knowledge about something in the way you might know facts about history or mathematics. It is knowledge that transforms the knower. Self-knowledge in the deepest possible sense. The recognition of what you fundamentally are. Tractate 4 of the Corpus Hermeticum, known as the mixing bowl or the crater, illustrates this beautifully. In this text, God has made a great mixing bowl, a crater, filled with divine mind, and has sent it down into the world as an invitation. Those human souls who wish to be immersed in it, who choose to plunge into divine mind, can do so. Those who respond receive Gnosis. They begin to know themselves, to recognize their divine origin, and this recognition itself begins the process of their liberation. Notice the imagery: baptism, immersion, the soul plunging into something that will transform it. This is not abstract philosophical reasoning. It is something closer to what religious traditions call direct experience. The gnosis that the Corpus Hermeticum is talking about is not achieved by argument alone. It involves a kind of direct apprehension of divine reality, a moment of genuine contact with the news that underlies everything. And crucially, the tractate frames this as a choice. Not everyone chooses to enter the mixing bowl. Some souls turn away, and in turning away, they become enslaved to the material qualities they chose instead. Tractate 10, called the Key, develops this further. It argues that the human mind, the human nous, is of the same nature as the divine nous, because like can only be known by like. The divine mind can only be known by a mind that partakes of the same nature, and since the human soul does partake of that nature, having descended from the divine Anthropos, it is in principle capable of knowing the divine directly. The knowledge of God and the knowledge of oneself are, in this framework, the same act. You cannot truly know one without knowing the other. This is profoundly important for understanding the Gnostic connection. In Valentinian Gnosticism, the three types of human beings are distinguished precisely by their capacity for gnosis. The pneumatic, those in whom the divine spark burns brightest, are capable of direct knowledge of the divine. This is not merely better morality or stronger faith. It is a different order of knowing, and the Hermetic texts are describing the same kind of knowing, though without quite the same typology of human beings. The possibility of gnosis in the Hermetic picture is universal, waiting for whoever chooses to seek it. In the Valentinian picture, it is restricted to the pneumatic. That is a genuinely significant difference in how the two traditions understand human nature. The Corpus Hermeticum is also clear that gnosis has ethical dimensions. Poimandres makes explicit that the person who has achieved gnosis is moved by love of the divine and by a corresponding detachment from the illusions of the material world. This is not asceticism in the sense of rejecting the body as evil. It is more like a reordering of priorities, a shift in what the soul takes to be real and valuable. The body continues to exist and to be cared for, but the soul is no longer deceived into thinking that material things are the ultimate reality. Several tractates address the question of what happens after physical death. The ascent through the seven spheres, described in Poimandres, is the path the liberated soul takes when it leaves the body. At each sphere, it surrenders the quality that sphere had imposed during the descent. At the moon, it surrenders the capacity for material increase and decrease. At Mercury, the machinery of deception. At Venus, the illusions of desire, and so on, up through all 7 levels, until the soul arrives at the Ogdoad, stripped of everything that was not originally its own, standing in its pure divine nature, ready to enter the presence of the highest God. What is genuinely striking about this picture is how close it is to the Gnostic schema of the soul passing through the archons after death, needing knowledge as the key to pass through each level. The mechanism differs between the Hermetic and Gnostic versions, but the underlying structure is the same. Having established what Poimandres does, it is worth walking through the other tractates in some detail, because they cover significantly different ground and reveal the full range of what Hermetic thought actually encompassed. Each text adds something that the others do not contain. Tractate 2, sometimes titled the General Discourse, deals with philosophical questions about the nature of God and the relationship between God, the cosmos, and the soul. It engages directly with Greek philosophical terminology, working through concepts like place, movement, and the incorporeal. Its most striking argument is that God cannot be encompassed by anything, because God encompasses everything. This strong statement of divine transcendence connects directly to the Gnostic insistence that the highest God is utterly beyond the created world, which is precisely why a lesser being, the demiurge, was responsible for actually making material things. The highest God does not reach down into matter. That would be a kind of contamination. Something lower must do that work, Tractate 3 is extremely short and reads almost like a poetic creation hymn. It describes the origin of all living things and the role of the divine word in giving them form. Brief as it is, it reinforces the cosmological picture established in Poimandres and does so in language of unusual beauty. Tractate 5 is a hymn of praise to the divine, cataloging the paradoxes of the transcendent God, visible and invisible, present everywhere and yet in no particular place, older than time and yet operating in every moment. This style of praise, listing the seemingly contradictory attributes of the divine, appears in both Gnostic texts and in Jewish mystical literature. It reflects a shared recognition that the highest divine reality cannot be captured in any single attribute and can only be approached through paradox. Tractate 6 argues that the good exists only in God and that the material world contains no genuine goodness, only imitations or appearances of it. This is one of the more pessimistic tractates in the collection, and it represents the strand of Hermetic thought that most closely resembles the Gnostic view of the material world as fundamentally inferior to the divine realm above it. Reading Tractate 6 alongside Tractate 5, which celebrates the divine presence throughout the cosmos, you can see the tension that runs through the entire Corpus Hermeticum. Is the material world a poor reflection of the divine or a beautiful expression of it? The collection does not give a single, uniform answer. It holds the tension. Tractate 7 is brief but forceful. It opens with a striking image of drunkenness. Most human beings, it argues, are drunk, not on wine, on ignorance. They stagger through life without knowing what they are, taking the material world for ultimate reality, taking their physical desires for their true selves. The tractate calls on the reader to sober up, to wake from this stupor, to begin the work of genuine self-knowledge. The language of drunkenness and sobriety as metaphors for spiritual ignorance and awakening also appears in Gnostic literature, particularly in Valentinian texts and in the Odes of Solomon, a collection of early Christian hymns showing significant Gnostic influence. The shared metaphor is not a coincidence. Tractate 8 deals with the soul and the body, arguing that nothing genuinely perishes in the cosmos and that what appears to be death is only change of form. This might seem like a more optimistic view, but it serves a specific philosophical point. The soul does not die when the body dies, because the soul belongs to the divine realm where genuine destruction is impossible. The tractate is careful to distinguish between the biological processes of the material body, which do involve real decay, and the soul itself, which participates in a different order of reality. Tractate 9, known as On Thought and Sensation, develops the epistemological implications of Hermetic theology. How do we know anything? What is the relationship between sensory perception and genuine understanding? The tractate argues that the mind is the true instrument of knowledge, not the senses, and that the highest form of knowledge, Gnosis, is a function of pure mind rather than of anything derived from the physical world. This is a position with deep roots in Plato's epistemology, but the Hermetic text takes it further by connecting it to a specific theology of the divine mind and the soul's kinship with it. Tractate 10, The Key, is one of the most philosophically substantial texts in the collection. It develops the idea that the human soul is capable of knowing the divine because it partakes of the divine nature, and it extends this to an argument about the relationship between mind, soul, and body. It also contains an important cosmological passage describing the structure of the divine world above the seven spheres, giving us more detail about the Ogdoad and the beings that inhabit it. Tractates 11 and 12 deal with what divine mind actually is, and with the omnipresence of the divine nous in all of creation. Tractate 12 in particular makes the striking argument that the divine mind is in everything, in the wise, in animals, in plants, even in what seems completely inert. This panpsychic tendency, the idea that mind or awareness pervades all of reality, is a recurring theme in philosophical Hermetism. It connects to certain strands of Stoic thought, and it resonates with some Gnostic ideas about the presence of divine sparks scattered throughout the material cosmos, waiting to be gathered back into the divine fullness from which they fell. Tractate 13 is among the most interesting in the entire collection. It is a dialogue between Hermes and his son Tat, and it deals explicitly with the concept of rebirth. Not reincarnation, though that concept does appear in Hermetic literature elsewhere, but rebirth in the sense of the transformation of consciousness that comes through Gnosis. Tat asks how he can be reborn, and Hermes tells him that it cannot happen through conventional instruction. It requires a kind of direct transmission, a moment of genuine opening. The 12 vices that govern the unawakened soul, corresponding to the 12 signs of the zodiac, must be overcome. And in their place, 10 divine powers enter: knowledge of God, joy, continence, perseverance, justice, liberality, truth, the good, life, and light. This tractate is often cited in discussions of whether Hermetism had actual ritual practices, because the structured transformation it describes suggests that something more than philosophical argument was involved in how Hermetic communities, if they existed, approached spiritual development. Tractate 14 deals with the relationship between the divine and the material cosmos, and with the role of the soul in giving life to the body. Tractate 15 explores the nature of time and eternity. Tractate 16 is formally a letter from Asclepius to a king, summarizing Hermetic teachings in a slightly different register, one that shows awareness of an audience beyond the immediate circle of Hermetic initiates. Tractate 17 is a very brief text, almost a fragment, dealing with the question of the soul and its relationship to the divine light. Together, these 16 tractates that follow Poimandres form a body of thought that is internally consistent despite its surface variety, all circling the same set of fundamental questions from different angles. Beyond the 17 tractates of the Corpus Hermeticum lies a body of closely related literature that is essential to a complete understanding of the tradition. The Asclepius is the most important of these. Known in Latin, almost certainly originally composed in Greek, and widely read in the Western Middle Ages, it takes the form of a dialogue between Hermes, his student Asclepius, and 2 other figures named Tat and Ammon. Its subject matter overlaps with the Corpus Hermeticum, but with notable additions. The most famous and most frequently cited passage in the Asclepius is what has come to be called the Lament of Hermes. Hermes pauses in his teaching to deliver what is essentially a prophecy of catastrophe. He foresees a time when Egypt, the land he calls more temple than any other, the land where the gods have dwelt on earth, will be abandoned. The gods will depart. The sacred rites will fall silent. Foreigners will come, filling the temples with their own gods or destroying them entirely. The wisdom of Egypt will be dismissed as superstition, laughed at by those who have no understanding of it. The cosmos itself will seem dark, as if the light that has always illumined it is being withdrawn. This is extraordinary writing. Whether it was composed as a genuine prophecy looking forward to the Christianization of Egypt, or as a lament looking back at changes already underway, or perhaps both at once, scholars cannot determine with certainty. What is clear is that it captures something real about the historical moment in which Hermetic literature emerged. The ancient religious world was changing, being displaced by new certainties, and the people who cared about the old wisdom were painfully aware of it. The lament expresses a grief that is historical and specific, not merely philosophical. The Asclepius also contains an important discussion of the human being as a dual creature, partly divine and partly material, with obligations to both realms. It explicitly calls human beings a great miracle, a being who has a unique place in the cosmos precisely because of this dual nature. This phrase became a famous humanist slogan in the Renaissance, and it is one of the passages that thinkers like Pico della Mirandola latched onto as expressing something fundamental about human dignity. But its Hermetic context makes clear that the greatness being celebrated is not human power over nature. It is the human soul's unique position as a bridge between the divine and the material, a position that carries both extraordinary privilege and extraordinary responsibility. The Stobaeus excerpts add significantly to the picture. The excerpt, known as Kore Cosmou, the Virgin of the World, presents a creation narrative from the perspective of Isis, positioned here as a revealer of divine wisdom, much as Sophia plays that role in various Gnostic texts. In this narrative, the divine being who created the world did so by sending divine souls down into matter to animate it, and those souls are in a state of longing to return to their origin. The text also describes the process by which souls choose their physical forms and the conditions of their earthly lives before descending into embodiment. This connects to broader Platonic ideas about the pre-cosmic choice of the soul, which Plato himself described in the myth of at the end of the Republic. The role given to Isis in Corpus Cosmos is worth pausing on. Isis in Egyptian religion was the goddess of magic, of healing, and of resurrection. Her association with divine wisdom and with the transmission of sacred knowledge to humanity has strong parallels with the figure of Sophia in Gnostic texts. Sophia, meaning wisdom, is one of the aeons or divine emanations of the pleroma in Valentinian Gnosticism, and her fall from the divine fullness sets in motion the creation of the material world. The structural parallel between Isis in Corpus Cosmos and Sophia in Valentinian texts reflects a shared pattern. The divine feminine as the intermediary between the highest divine world and the material cosmos, as the wisdom that guides souls through the conditions of embodied existence toward their eventual return. Another Stobaeus excerpt, sometimes called On the Soul and on Providence, deals with the role of fate in human life and the question of whether genuine freedom is possible within a cosmos governed by the 7 governors. The answer it gives is nuanced. Fate governs the body and the conditions of material life, but the soul itself, in its innermost divine nature, transcends fate. This is the part of the human being that can achieve Gnosis, because it is the part that was never entirely subject to the conditions of material existence. The soul may be in the world that fate governs. It is not ultimately of it. The definitions of Hermes Trismegistus, the Armenian text, is structured as a series of short philosophical propositions, and it is remarkable for the precision of its theological language. It defines God, the soul, the mind, speech, and light in crisp, memorable formulations. One of its most important definitions states that God is an intelligible light that existed before intelligible light. This is almost pure, apophatic theology. God is described as the source of a quality, intelligible light, which is already far beyond the material, but God is even beyond that. This kind of layered transcendence, the sense that every description of God must be immediately exceeded by something still greater, is characteristic of both the Hermetic tradition and the Gnostic tradition's approach to the nature of the highest divine reality. The distinction between technical and philosophical Hermetism is one of the most important scholarly contributions to our understanding of this tradition, and it is almost always overlooked in popular discussions. The ancient world attributed to Hermes Trismegistus not just the philosophical texts we have been discussing, but an enormous body of practical knowledge: astrology, alchemy, medicine, magic, and what was called astral medicine, the use of astrological knowledge to guide healing. Texts on all of these subjects circulated under the name of Hermes, and in the ancient world they were taken just as seriously as the philosophical texts. Both kinds of Hermetic text presuppose a cosmos in which the 7 planetary spheres exert genuine influence on earthly events and on human beings. Both presuppose a meaningful relationship between the heavens and the earth, between the macrocosm and the microcosm. Both draw on a tradition of sacred knowledge attributed to Hermes as its ultimate divine source. So far, so unified, but the emphasis, the purpose, and the anthropology are quite different in ways that matter for understanding the Gnostic connection. The technical Hermetic texts are focused on mastery. The person who has learned astrology correctly can read fate in the stars. The person who has learned alchemy correctly can work with the transformative properties of substances. The person who has learned Hermetic magic correctly can invoke and direct divine powers. In each case, the goal is some form of earthly benefit or practical capability. The 7 planetary powers are not something to transcend. They are something to understand well enough to work with. The philosophical Hermetic texts, the texts of the Corpus Hermeticum, are focused not on mastery but on liberation. The goal is not to manipulate the cosmos but to understand it well enough to transcend it. The goal is not to work with the 7 planetary powers but to pass through them on the way to something beyond them. This is why the philosophical Hermetic tradition has such strong resonances with Gnosticism. Both are ultimately concerned with the soul's liberation from a cosmos that, however beautiful it may be, is not the soul's true home. The technical Hermetic texts appear to be older in some of their components, drawing on genuine Egyptian and Babylonian astrological traditions that predate the philosophical texts by centuries. The philosophical texts, by contrast, are much more clearly products of the Greek philosophical culture of Alexandria in the 1st through 3rd centuries CE. They use Platonic vocabulary. They engage with Platonic problems. They reflect the concerns of a community that had absorbed Platonism thoroughly and was using it to articulate a religious vision that went beyond what Plato himself had offered. When scholars talk about the Corpus Hermeticum's relationship to Gnosticism, they are primarily talking about the philosophical strand of Hermetism. The technical texts have their own fascinating history, but they are a somewhat different conversation. This is the question that has occupied scholars of late antiquity and early religious history for the better part of 2 centuries, and it does not have a clean answer, which makes it all the more interesting. The argument for seeing Hermetism as a form of Gnosticism goes something like this. Both traditions share a characteristic cosmological picture, a transcendent highest God, a lesser creator figure responsible for the material world, a series of cosmic powers standing between the human soul and its divine origin, and a dualistic understanding of the human being as a composite of divine and material elements. Both traditions identify ignorance as the fundamental problem of human existence and gnosis as the solution. Both describe a path of ascent for the liberated soul through the cosmic levels. Both emerged from the same cultural environment in Alexandria and show awareness of the same texts and the same philosophical concerns. The argument against identifying Hermetism with Gnosticism goes like this. The Hermetic texts do not share the Gnostic tradition's characteristic hostility toward the material world. In most philosophical Hermetic texts, the material world is not a prison built by a malevolent or ignorant creator. It is a beautiful and divinely ordered cosmos, imperfect by comparison with the divine realm above it, but still worthy of reverence and contemplation. The Hermetic God does not make a mistake in creating the world. The Hermetic governors are not archons in the full Gnostic sense. They are cosmic powers that can be transcended, but they are not adversaries. And the Hermetic path does not involve the kind of cosmic rebellion, the sharp break from the Creator and his creation that characterizes the most distinctive Sethian Gnostic texts. The scholar Garth Fowden, in his influential work on the Egyptian Hermes, argued that Hermetism represents a distinct religious tradition that developed alongside Gnosticism and in conversation with it but should not be subsumed into it. Fowden emphasized the Egyptian religious dimensions of Hermetism and the importance of understanding it within the context of Egyptian priestly culture, not simply as a variant of Greek Platonism or as a version of Gnosticism. The scholars André-Jean Festugière and Arthur Darby Nock, whose 4-volume study of Hermetic literature remains a landmark of scholarship, took a somewhat different view, emphasizing the Greek philosophical roots of the philosophical Hermetic texts and treating them primarily as products of Platonic religious speculation rather than as documents of a distinct religious community with strong Egyptian roots. Festugière, in particular, was skeptical of the idea that there were genuine Hermetic communities organized around these texts, preferring to see them as literary productions of individual intellectuals working within a broader Platonic tradition. More recent scholars like Wouter Hanegraaff have emphasized the importance of treating Hermetism as a tradition in its own right, one that cannot be adequately understood by simply assigning it to an already existing category. Hermetism is not Gnosticism. It is not Middle Platonism. It is not Egyptian religion. It is something that emerged from the creative interaction of all of these, and it needs to be understood on its own terms. This position has gained significant traction in contemporary scholarship and represents what might be called the current consensus, if there is one. What can be said with confidence is this: the Corpus Hermeticum and the Gnostic texts emerged from the same cultural matrix. They share intellectual sources, they share vocabulary, they share fundamental concerns. They represent different responses to the same set of questions, different articulations of what it means to be a being of divine origin living in a material world. The relationship between them is one of conversation rather than identity. The Hermetic texts are not Gnostic texts, but they are deeply resonant with Gnosticism, and understanding both illuminates each. The specific point where the two traditions come closest is their shared use of the Anthropos Myth, the myth of the primordial divine human whose descent into matter explains the human condition. This myth appears in Poimandres, It appears in Sethian Gnostic texts in the figure of Adamus or the heavenly Seth. It appears in Valentinian thought in the complex figure of the divine Anthropos, who is the first emanation of the Pleroma. It appears in the Manichaean tradition as the primal man, the divine being who descended into the realm of darkness and whose scattered light particles are imprisoned in matter. This is one of the most widely distributed mythological structures of late antiquity, and its presence in both Hermetic and Gnostic literature is not a coincidence. It represents a shared answer to a question that both traditions felt with equal urgency. Why does consciousness feel so out of place in the material world? Because both traditions answered, it is out of place. It came from somewhere else, and it can, through the right kind of knowing, find its way back. One of the questions that the texts themselves raise but do not definitively answer is whether there were actual communities of Hermetic practitioners, groups of people who organized their religious life around these texts and the ideas they contain. The texts suggest the existence of such communities in several ways, and the question matters for understanding the relationship between Hermetism and the Gnostic groups that clearly did have organized community life. Several tractates read as if they are initiatory texts designed to be received at a specific stage in a student's development. Tractate 13, with its account of the rebirth experience, reads particularly like something used in a ritual context rather than simply as a text to be read alone. Hermes tells Tet that he cannot transmit the experience of rebirth through ordinary teaching but can only create the conditions for it to occur. The language implies actual presence, actual transmission between a teacher and a student in a specific setting, not simply the consumption of a written text. Tractate 1 describes the narrator going out after his experience of Gnosis to teach others, to call on people to give up their ignorant sleep and seek knowledge of their true nature. This is the language of a missionary tradition, of people who felt they had something urgent to share with those around them. Poimandres commands Hermes to become a guide for those who are capable of receiving the knowledge, which implies a social role, a teacher-student relationship embedded in community life. Several tractates also contain elements that look like prayers or hymns, liturgical texts that would make more sense as parts of actual religious practice than as purely literary exercises. A thanksgiving prayer found in a different version among the Coptic texts from the broader Gnostic milieu suggests that this piece of text was in use in at least one religious community, supporting the idea that the boundary between Hermetic and Gnostic textual communities was not perfectly sharp, but the evidence remains indirect. Unlike the Gnostic groups that left records of their communal practices and organizational structures, the Hermetic tradition left almost no direct evidence of community life. No membership records, no accounts of actual initiatory ceremonies, no records of the kind of doctrinal disputes that characterize well-documented religious communities. Garth Fowden argued for the existence of what he called Hermetic circles, small groups of devoted students gathered around a master, practicing a form of spiritual philosophy involving both study and some form of experiential spiritual practice. This model is plausible and fits what the texts suggest, but it remains speculative. What is certain is that the texts were produced by someone, for someone. They carry too much urgency, too much personal intensity, too much concern with the experiential reality of the divine to be merely literary productions designed for a general readership. Whether the communities that used them had elaborate organizational structures or were simply small circles of like-minded seekers is something the evidence does not allow us to determine. But the care with which the texts were gathered, copied, and preserved through the Byzantine period implies ongoing communities of readers who continued to find them meaningful enough to transmit across generations. The question of when the Hermetic philosophical texts were written is one that has been debated since at least the 17th century, when an event occurred that completely transformed how the Western world understood them. For most of the ancient, medieval, and Renaissance periods, it was assumed that these texts were genuinely ancient, composed by Hermes Trismegistus himself in a mythically remote period predating recorded history. This belief shaped not only how the texts were received, but also what questions were asked of them. In 1614, the scholar Isaac Casaubon published a detailed linguistic analysis of the Greek texts of the Corpus Hermeticum and demonstrated conclusively that they could not have been composed before the 1st century CE. His argument was methodologically precise and devastating. The Greek language used in the texts contains vocabulary, grammatical constructions, and philosophical terminology that did not exist before the Platonic and Stoic philosophical traditions of the Hellenistic period. A text genuinely composed in ancient Egypt, centuries before Plato, could not possibly contain this kind of language. Casaubon concluded that the texts were composed no earlier than the 1st century of the Common Era, and the scholarly consensus has confirmed him. Modern scholarship generally dates the philosophical Hermetic texts date to between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, with most of the Corpus Hermeticum likely composed in the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. This puts their composition at roughly the same time as many of the foundational Gnostic texts and in the same cultural environment. The Valentinian Gnostic school was active in Rome and Alexandria in the 2nd century. Sethian Gnostic texts were being composed and circulated in Egypt during the same period. The philosophical Hermetic texts belong to the same intellectual moment, the same broad cultural conversation. This dating has an important implication for how we understand the relationship between Hermetic and Gnostic thought. They were not related by direct descent, one from the other. They were contemporaneous developments within the same cultural milieu, drawing from the same sources and responding to the same questions. The similarities between them are the product of shared context rather than direct borrowing in either direction, though occasional specific borrowings cannot be ruled out. This means that when scholars find a particular image or formulation that appears in both a Hermetic text and a Gnostic text, the first question is not which borrowed from which, but rather what shared source or shared intellectual environment both were drawing from. The shared sources are substantial. Both traditions drew on Middle Platonism, the philosophical tradition that had developed from Plato's thought in the centuries between Plato himself and the Neoplatonists of the 3rd century CE. Both drew on Jewish cosmological speculation, particularly the tradition of interpreting the Genesis creation narrative in Platonic terms, a project that Alexandria's Jewish community had been engaged in for at least 2 centuries before the Hermetic texts were composed, and both were responding to the specifically religious needs of a cosmopolitan, educated audience in the Roman Empire, people who found neither traditional polytheism nor mainstream Judaism nor emerging Christianity entirely adequate to their deepest questions about the divine and about the human soul. The survival of the Corpus Hermeticum through the centuries between its composition in Roman Alexandria and its arrival in Renaissance Florence is a story worth telling on its own terms. It was far from guaranteed. Many texts from the late antique period did not survive. The conditions that allowed these texts to make it through are historically interesting and are connected directly to the broader story of how Gnostic and adjacent spiritual literature fared in the face of Orthodox Christian culture. The rise of Christianity as the dominant religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century was not immediately catastrophic for the Hermetic texts. Several church fathers had expressed qualified admiration for them, and the texts were not obviously incompatible with certain forms of Christian theology, particularly in the passages where Hermetic thought seemed to anticipate Christian ideas about the Logos or the Divine Son. Lactantius quoted the Hermetic texts as evidence of pagan prophecy. Clement of Alexandria treated them as part of the broad inheritance of ancient wisdom that Christianity had surpassed but not entirely displaced. But as Orthodox Christianity became more rigid in its definitions and more hostile to alternative forms of religious thought, the philosophical climate that had produced the Hermetic literature became increasingly marginal. The texts survived because Byzantine scholars continued to copy them. Byzantium, the eastern continuation of the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, preserved an enormous amount of classical and late antique Greek literature that would otherwise have been completely lost. Byzantine intellectual culture maintained a complicated relationship with pre-Christian Greek thought. It was part of their cultural heritage, a point of legitimate pride, even as it was theologically problematic. Philosophers like Michael Psellus in the 11th century engaged seriously with Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophy, and within that tradition of engagement, the Hermetic texts had a place. They were not suppressed in Byzantium, though they were not promoted either. They occupied a zone of tolerated but muted classical learning, available to scholars who sought them out but not part of the mainstream curriculum. The manuscript that eventually came to Florence is generally identified as the manuscript known to scholars as the Laurentianus, named for the Laurentian library where it is still held. Copied in the Byzantine period, it contained 14 of the 17 tractates of what we now call the Corpus Hermeticum, along with other texts. It was this manuscript that Marsilio Ficino translated in a burst of focused work in 1463. The story of what happened when the Corpus Hermeticum arrived in Florence is one of the most vivid illustrations available of how a text can change the world it enters. Marsilio Ficino was a young philosopher and physician, already at work translating Plato's complete works for Cosimo de Medici, the wealthy banker and patron who had effectively commissioned a program of classical scholarship in Florence. When Leonardo of Pistoia arrived with the Hermetic manuscript in 1463, Cosimo was in his mid-70s and in poor health. He knew he was dying, and he told Ficino to stop everything. Stop Plato. Translate this first. He wanted to read it before he died. Ficino complied. He worked extraordinarily quickly and produced a Latin translation within a matter of months. Cosimo did read it before his death in 1464. That fact alone tells you something about what the manuscript represented. This was not curiosity about a historical artifact. This was urgency about something that felt immediately relevant. Ficino's translation circulated rapidly and was printed in 1471, becoming one of the most widely read texts of the Renaissance. Within a few decades, it had gone through numerous editions and been read by virtually every significant intellectual in Europe. It hit the humanist world with the force of a revelation. Why? Because of what the texts seemed to prove. Renaissance humanists had been building an intellectual tradition based on the recovery of ancient wisdom. Some believed that there had been a continuous tradition of divine wisdom running from the earliest human history through various sages, a tradition they called the Prisca Theologia, or ancient theology. The idea was that Hermes had received this wisdom first, and that it had flowed through Zoroaster, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato, each building on the one before. The Corpus Hermeticum seemed to confirm this story in the most dramatic possible way. Ficino and his contemporaries believed it was composed by Hermes before the time of Moses, before the Greek philosophers. And yet it contained ideas that resonated with Platonic philosophy and, in certain passages, seemed to anticipate Christian insights about the Logos and the Son of God. If genuine, this meant that the ancient world had possessed divine wisdom that the Christian revelation had only made explicit, and that the different streams of human wisdom across history were all flowing toward the same divine truth. Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man is one of the most famous texts of the Renaissance, drew heavily on Hermetic ideas. The famous passage in which Pico imagines God telling Adam that he has no fixed place in the order of creation, no predetermined nature, but can shape himself toward the divine or toward the material, is saturated with Hermetic anthropology. The Hermetic insistence on the human being as a unique composite creature, belonging fully to neither the divine world nor the material world, translated into Renaissance terms as a vision of radical human freedom and potential. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher burned at the stake in 1600, was perhaps the most radical user of Hermetic ideas in this period. He read the Hermetic texts as a complete religious and philosophical system capable of replacing Christianity, which he considered a derivative and inferior version of the older Hermetic wisdom. His views were extreme by any measure, and they contributed significantly to his fate at the hands of the Inquisition. But they illustrate the intellectual power that the Corpus Hermeticum had over minds that encountered it. For Bruno, these were not historical curiosities. They were living truth. Then came 1614 and Isaac Casaubon. Casaubon was one of the finest classical philologists of his era, a man of prodigious learning and precise analytical skill. Writing partly in the context of Protestant Catholic theological controversies, in which the Hermetic texts had been used by Catholic scholars as evidence for the harmony between classical wisdom and Christian revelation, he had both scholarly and polemical reasons to examine these texts closely. His examination was devastating. He showed, systematically and conclusively, that the Greek of the Hermetic texts could not predate the 1st century CE. Specific words appeared that were not in use before the Hellenistic period. Specific philosophical concepts were deployed that had not been articulated before Plato. Specific theological formulations reflected the debates and vocabulary of 2nd century Platonism and early Christianity. The conclusion was inescapable. The Corpus Hermeticum was not composed by an ancient Egyptian sage in a mythical past. It was composed by Greek-speaking intellectuals in Roman Egypt, probably in the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era. It was not a source of Platonic philosophy. It was a product of it. For the Renaissance humanist tradition that had built so much on the supposed antiquity of the Hermetic texts, this was a serious blow. The Prisca Theologia narrative, the story of Hermes as the first recipient of divine wisdom passed down through the ages, was suddenly on very shaky ground. If the texts were composed in the 2nd century CE, then they were younger than most of the classical philosophical sources they seem to have anticipated. Rather than predating and prefiguring Plato, they were post-dating and adapting him. But the actual story of the Corpus Hermeticum's reception after Casaubon is more complicated than a simple narrative of debunking followed by abandonment. Interest in the texts did not stop. Serious scholars continued to engage with them. What Casaubon's work actually did, in the long run, was not to diminish the texts, but to change the question. Instead of asking what ancient wisdom they transmitted, scholars began asking what they actually said, where they actually came from, and what they tell us about the intellectual and religious world that produced them. That is a more honest set of questions, and it is the set of questions that modern scholarship has been wrestling with ever since. Casaubon did not discredit the Corpus Hermeticum. He liberated it from a mythology that was obscuring its genuine historical and philosophical significance. The influence of the Corpus Hermeticum on subsequent religious and intellectual history is extensive, and within the specific context of Gnostic thought, it is particularly significant. In the ancient world, the philosophical Hermetic texts circulated in the same environment as the Gnostic texts and almost certainly influenced them, and were influenced by them, in return. The shared vocabulary, shared mythological structures, and shared concerns between the two bodies of literature were not accidental. Both represented part of a broader movement in the Mediterranean world of the 1st through 4th centuries, a movement that sought to understand the divine through inner experience, that rejected the purely material understanding of human life as an adequate account, and that insisted on the reality of a transcendent divine realm from which human souls had descended and to which they could return through knowledge. As Gnosticism was pushed to the margins of Christianity and eventually suppressed, and as the late antique world was increasingly shaped by an orthodox Christianity hostile to these currents, both Gnostic and Hermetic traditions went underground. They survived in manuscript form, in isolated communities, in the memory of traditions driven out of the mainstream. The Latin Asclepius survived in European libraries throughout the Middle Ages, quoted and alluded to by medieval thinkers who did not always recognize what they were citing, but who were nonetheless transmitting fragments of the Hermetic tradition into the new intellectual environment of medieval Christianity. When Ficino's translation appeared in 1471, it gave the full philosophical Hermetic tradition a new life. Through the Renaissance Neoplatonic and Hermetic movements, Hermetic ideas became deeply embedded in the Western esoteric tradition, the tradition of thought and practice running through Renaissance natural magic, through the Rosicrucian movement of the early 17th century, through the various alchemical traditions, and eventually into the modern Western esoteric movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. Within specifically Gnostic revivals, the Hermetic texts have been a consistent presence. The 19th century Theosophical movement, which drew heavily on Gnostic cosmological ideas and represented in many ways a modern reworking of Gnostic sensibility, also drew on the Hermetic tradition. The structural bones of Theosophical cosmology, its picture of layered cosmic planes, of spiritual beings inhabiting different levels of reality, of the human soul as a fragment of divine consciousness on a long journey through matter, are recognizably related to both Hermetic and Gnostic cosmology. The genuine scholarly study of the Corpus Hermeticum as a historical document, as a product of a specific time and place with its own distinctive concerns, has produced a body of work over the last century that has fundamentally transformed our understanding of what these texts are and what they mean. The work of scholars like Festugière, Fowden, Copenhaver, and Hanegraaff has given us a picture that is more historically grounded, more intellectually honest, and more genuinely interesting than the mythologized picture that dominated from antiquity through the Renaissance. That picture tells us that the Corpus Hermeticum was produced by people who were asking questions that still matter. How did consciousness get here? Why does it feel foreign to the material world? What is the relationship between the individual mind and whatever ultimate intelligence underlies the cosmos? Is there a way to know the divine directly? These questions were answered differently by different communities in the remarkable intellectual ferment of Roman Alexandria. The Gnostics answered them with myths of cosmic rebellion and divine sparks. The Neoplatonists answered them with structures of emanation and return. The philosophical Hermetists answered them with visions of descent and ascent, with the imagery of a divine mind becoming entangled with material existence and then finding its way back through the shock of genuine self-knowledge. The answers were different. The urgency behind the questions was identical. After all of this, after the cosmogony of Poimandres and the myth of the fallen Anthropos, after the soul's long journey through the 7 planetary governors, after the debates about whether these texts are Gnostic or adjacent to Gnosticism, after the Renaissance rediscovery and Casaubon's correction and the long scholarly effort to understand what these texts actually are, one insight becomes visible that could not have been seen at the beginning. The Corpus Hermeticum is not primarily a cosmological document, though it contains cosmology. It is not primarily a philosophical document, though it uses philosophy throughout. It is not primarily a historical document, though its historical context is fascinating. At its core, it is a document about the strangeness of self-awareness. The Anthropos Myth, the central myth shared by both Hermetism and Gnosticism, is not really a story about the origin of the cosmos. It is a story about the experience of being conscious in a material world. The divine mind looks into matter and sees itself reflected back. And in that moment of recognition, something happens. The infinite becomes finite, the light becomes entangled with the dark. The knowing becomes the known. Every thinking person who has ever looked at their own reflection in water and felt the slight vertigo of the encounter is enacting that myth at a very small scale. Every moment in which awareness turns back on itself and wonders what it is, where it came from, why it is here, is a small version of the Anthropos reaching toward his own image in the waters below. The Hermetic and Gnostic traditions both took that experience of self-aware consciousness and built an entire cosmology around it. They asked, if the divine is infinite and the material world is finite, and if there is something in the human being that partakes of both, what does that tell us about the nature of reality? What does it mean that the universe has produced beings who are aware of themselves and aware of the universe and can ask questions about both? The texts do not give a comfortable answer. They say something hard and strange, that the soul is a visitor here, that it came from somewhere else, and that the path back requires a kind of knowing so deep and so total that it amounts to a transformation of what you are. Whether that picture is literally true in the way its authors intended is a question each person must answer for themselves. But the question it is pointing at has not gone away. Consciousness remains the most surprising thing in the known cosmos. Where it came from, what it is, and what, if anything, it is pointing toward, are questions that modern neuroscience and philosophy of mind are still wrestling with in their own vocabulary, using their own methods. The Corpus Hermeticum was one of the earliest sustained attempts in the Western tradition to take that strangeness seriously, to refuse to explain it away, and to insist that the fact of human self-awareness is not a footnote to the story of the cosmos. It is the story of the cosmos, telling itself, in the only medium available, a mind that knows it exists. That thought, once you have followed it all the way through the texts that gave rise to it, does not stay quietly where you put it.